Next talk is neuropsychology plus an inclusion expert equals how to override your brain with Dr. Bryant Horowitz and author Kryss Shane. In this probing conversation, Dr. Bryant Horowitz and author and educator Kryss Shane will explore how the unknown causes fear responses in the brain, how fear responses can lead to harming others, the differences in race, gender, sexuality, and how we can rewire to remove the fear responses so we are, at worst, not threatening, and at best, more inclusive. As an associate professor at East Los Angeles College, Dr. Horowitz teaches coursework in Introductory to Psychology, Biopsychology / behavioral neuroscience, and research methods for psychology and social sciences. And Kryss Shane is the author of Creating an LGBT plus Inclusive Workplace, the Practical Resource Guide for Business Leaders. Now, please help me welcome Dr. Bryant Horowitz and Kryss Shane.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much, Hunter. This has been such a fun Power to Fly. We are about midway through day 1 of 3. They're never long enough, and I could just do them forever. So we are getting started in a fantastic conversation with Dr. Bryant Horowitz, who I knew before he was a doctor, although he's always been that smart. How's it going, Bryant?
It's going pretty well. How are you doing over there, Kryss?
I am excited to learn about the aspects. I think about the way we behave, but really all of our behavior, I guess, is based on the way the brain is telling us what to do, right?
Absolutely. Every little thing, every thought, every feeling, every urge, up to the big things like complex behaviors is based on the brain. Even our reactionary stuff, reflexes, automatic thoughts, is still the brain working, but we have two different sort of modes. We have the unconscious automatic brain that does things from remembering for us to breathe to simple things that are part of our routine, like remembering to brush your teeth every day where you don't have to think about it, to, of course, all of the deliberate things that we do consciously and with purposeful effort.
Okay, so one of the things I hear a lot when I'm doing training on equity and inclusion is that people have this sense of fear, that there is this fear about gay people or about trans people. And we're seeing states talking now about the gay panic defense and the trans panic defense, which comes out of, I was afraid because they were gay, or I was afraid because they were transgender, and it makes it legally okay that I harmed or killed them. What's happening then in our brain when we're having that fear response to somebody who's gay or transgender?
Well, first of all, let me give you a little bit of a background on fear. Fear was actually believed to be the first emotion that developed. And this was, this goes all the way back to William James in the early 1900s and all the way back to Charles Darwin, where the reasoning for that is that fear, if you don't have fear of an environment, you don't have fear of something, you're not going to know when there's danger and when to avoid something. So fear is the most primal of the emotional responses, and that we need to fear our environment in order to survive. So that's why the emotion of fear is probably also the most powerful one, besides being the most basic one. So in terms of evolution, let's say cavemen were learning to be human and they found a cave where there was a saber-toothed tiger. You walk into the cave, and if you're not afraid of that tiger, if that doesn't, activate your fight or flight response, you're probably not going to survive to have offspring or just to see another day. So the fear response is the most primal. It's also the most powerful one. And so that translates to modern day into anything that is foreign to us, anything that creates that fear response, causes us to behave in a way that is a lot of times counterproductive. The other thing about that is that fear is that emotion, and these emotions cause us to act. I talked about the unconscious versus the conscious brain. That causes an unconscious reaction. It is an instinctual reaction. It is a reflexive reaction. Fight or flight is defined by either staying and fighting whatever it is that's in front of you or running away. And a lot of times when it is a response like somebody different from yourself, where it could be a different gender, a different race, or in this case, how somebody identifies themselves, people are going to have that fear reaction that causes them to act in a certain way. They fear what they don't know. And if you're not familiar with something, or you've heard your whole life that it's not right, that it's different, whether it's a religious, portion that you grew up in, or whether it's, just that neighborhood, that area of the world, you're going to have that reaction as an automatic response to something that you don't know.
So if that's a natural thing that happens, but we see it in society as being, say, homophobic or transphobic, is that just inherent then, that some people just are like that and that's it?
Well, no, hopefully not. But we hear this a lot, especially in the last year with the George Floyd case. We hear it a lot more with racism. A lot of times we hear it with sexism. And of course, it comes up as, homophobia and transphobia and things like that. And a lot of it comes from the fact that we just allow our unconscious brain to do all the talking, so to speak. And the best way to combat this, of course, is to make the unconscious conscious. So rather than to just react the way that you would automatically, basically we want to try to take a step back and think about what we're going to say and make it conscious before we say it or do it. When we talk about encounters with other people that are different from us, we talk about it in a way that we try to bring out the conscious thought, to think about what we're going to say before we say it. Obviously, you've heard the terms prejudice and you've heard the term discrimination, but I don't know that everybody knows the difference between those. To be prejudiced to something is to have a prejudicial or prejudgment in your brain. That's your automatic brain. That is the unconscious brain. Discrimination is the actual act of violence or saying something, and that would be bringing the conscious thought along with it. But one pretty much follows the other. So the way to sort of break this not only to be educated about it, which thankfully your books do, teach people how to be educated about it, but to think about it and try to make a conscious effort to not only understand, but to be able to change your behavior. You need to get out of that automatic way of thinking and put some real effortful thinking in its place.
So let me make sure I understand. So this would sort of be like, I have a prejudice against vegetables because I already decide I won't like them. And because I think I won't like them, it causes me to discriminate by refusing to eat any vegetables.
Right.
Right? Am I right so far? Okay.
Yes, you are. And you've just described my 9-year-old's way of life.
Well, or my own way of life, or both of them, So then the way to get, well, let's be honest, the way to get either one of us to decide to eat more vegetables, I guess really is sort of the old parenting trick of try it, you'll like it.
Yes, and to learn about it. Obviously, a child is not going to say, not going to care about the nutritional value of these things, but as adults, you would think we're a little more responsible in that. Now, I fall under that same category where most vegetables are pretty gross to me as well, but it's about learning about them, understanding about them, and being on that same page. So broccoli and I were not really friends, but broccoli is something that I eat on a regular basis. I have not grown to love it in the fact that it tastes like ice cream. but I have been able to tolerate it. First, I had it with, cheddar cheese sauce on top, or, combined in with other foods and things like that. And so that gave me a little bit more of an understanding. Okay, broccoli's not terrible. And then it put me in a more conscious, effortful process of, okay, I can do this, and now I can eat it on my own. And this is sort of the way we would think about this for the LGBTQ community, for racism, for sexism, and things like that.
So
Learning to understand. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it sounds like if we use what our brain does to our advantage by training it, the way we do with I was going to say with kids, but with all of us, with vegetables, is really what gets us to that level of tolerance with people. And then it just becomes, when it's no longer unconscious bias and we're aware of it, that's when we can really start doing the deeper dive work to go from tolerating to accepting, and from accepting to affirming, and from affirming to celebrating. But
that's absolute.
Okay, so those first steps then, I mean, I'm not going to be probably attending a broccoli parade anytime soon.
Right.
I never made
Nor
it.
am I.
Sauce part of the broccoli trying. I think people just gave up. But it sounds like we can't get to, not that we won't, but we actually in our brain cannot get to the celebrating and the affirming part if we don't start way back at the beginning of the conversation.
Yes. And one of the biggest flaws and biggest problems is that when you try to explain this to people, they get really defensive. And that's also an automatic behavior based on the fear response. And so what you'll see is they'll double down. I talked about this recently with the protests and the George Floyd case and all of this, is that people double down on their racism because not only do they not want to be lectured, they don't want to know, and their brain does not like to know, that everything they thought about the world was completely the opposite. So when you grow up in a religious household, or in certain sections of the United States, especially, maybe even the world, you're taught that homophobia is bad. You're taught that the Bible says that males and other males should not be together, among other things. And so this is your worldview. So it's not just an unconscious bias, but it's something that these people have grown up with and grown, matured with. And
so homophobia
their view
wouldn't be an individual, independent phobia, fear, discomfort of gay people. It's literally ingrained in their cultural belief and their sense of the world around them.
Right. And when people are, talking about homophobia and things like this, they don't believe that they have a bias because, again, it's unconscious. And when you try to tell them this, they double down on their stance because, again, the fear takes over, the emotion takes over, it short circuits your conscious processes, and you go into defense mode. So this is their fight or flight. What I know is right, what you say is wrong, and I'm doubling down on this. So the idea is to try to come at them in a less threatening way to their own brain and try to open a dialogue and conversation. And then once that door has been opened to the conscious process, and we're no longer dealing, hopefully, with that unconscious bias, then we can learn to understand things from a central perspective, and then hopefully continue that conversation in the way that you were just discussing.
So we've talked about sort of this idea of getting ourselves to try vegetables and baby stepping, because we as people, or especially when we're adults, where we can start to think about the nutritional value, as you mentioned, of why there's enough benefit to broccoli that maybe it outweighs the taste of it, which, it's probably biased right there. I am biased against broccoli. And that makes me prejudiced against broccoli, which, it all kind of circles right back. How do we do that? If I can do that for myself, but I know the nutritional value for my own body is worth pushing through a taste I don't necessarily like right away.
Mm-hmm.
How do I get somebody else? How do I make my brain do that to somebody else's brain if they don't see an inherent value in what I'm trying to get them to try?
Well, again, unlike parents who may try to say do it or else and try to force it down their throat, you can't force your views on other people. So a lot of times it's just about feeling it out and seeing if you can make smaller points about it. Well, broccoli's not the worst tasting thing in the world. Well, broccoli, may be good for you. Maybe you can tolerate it with other things, and just sort of slowly work your way in that way. Of course, education is the best tool, right? People who have higher education are able to see different views of the world that may not necessarily line up with their own. And you get that idea of pros and cons, your side versus their side. There's points to both sides of every discussion. And it's just about allowing them to feel comfortable enough and buy into the smaller things. And then once they get the smaller points, then maybe you can go to the bigger things. In social psychology, we call this the foot in the door phenomenon. So if you can, in terms of, instead of broccoli, let's talk about in terms of borrowing money. If you want somebody to get the whole kit and caboodle, we'll call that the $100 realization. You're not going to just go up to them and say, hey, can I get $100? You might go up to them though and say, how about this little bit of information for $10? If I can just get $10 from you and then I pay you back, then in the future, you're much more likely to allow me to borrow that, $100, or you're able to get that $100 point across. So this idea of the foot in the door phenomenon is get them to understand on a basic level, a small piece of information. These people are not trying to harm your way of life. They're not trying to convert you into something that you're not. This is not something that, this is not pie. If equal rights does not mean less rights for you. And if they can understand those little points, those basic points, then eventually you can open up the conversation to something greater.
Well, it sounds like it makes logical sense, and it works with broccoli, and it works with money. What do we do when in the meantime, like we can take weeks or months to get a kid to eat some broccoli, or we can offer cauliflower and carrots and other vegetables? What do we do when the fear in somebody's brain is causing them to physically harm another person? Do we have that patient in baby step while somebody and groups of people's lives are at risk?
I mean, these people that are causing harm, those are the ones that are doubling down. So it's going to take a little more effort with those people than it is with maybe somebody else that's on the fence, or they don't know, or they're not physically harming somebody else. If we think about the idea of raising children, you talked about, and as my son, broke in and poked his head into this seminar.
His boy bun. He's not really old enough to have a man bun yet.
Right. Yes, his definite choices in hairstyles. Is that a lot of the things we do, we reward good behavior and we punish bad behavior. This is an idea called operant conditioning, which has been around for many years. And so some of these habits that we have to break may come with these type of conditioning lessons. Reward with good things, or bad behavior, you take away certain things. Obviously, some of the things they take away, if somebody harms another person, they might see jail time, which is another form of this, operant conditioning punishment. But when we think of things like, we can go to another modality and think of things like biting your nails. One of the things that we try to do is condition that out of people. So biting your nails, there are certain ways you can do it. If they bite their nails, sometimes you can paint nail polish on so it will taste bitter. That happens with dogs. We give a bitter spray when they try to dig or chew up shoes or things like that. We also reward for the good behaviors. So if my child does come around and eat broccoli, or if my associate Kryss Shane finally does come around and eat broccoli, maybe she can get rewarded with dessert, something, ice cream, something that would be pleasurable. In this case, maybe we can point out certain advantages and condition that bad behavior out of them, and try to at the same time condition the better, more tolerable behavior in. And again, when we're doing this, we're taking it from an unconscious automatic process and making it more conscious. So they are, consciously making the decision for this reward or to avoid this punishment in order to do that. Now, of course, that's on a very basic level, but it can be applied in this modality as well.
The baby stepping idea actually makes me think about some research that was done, goodness gracious, a long time ago when the gay marriage ban Prop 8 was happening in California.
Yes.
And one of the research studies at the time was looking at what makes a person vote or not vote for what they then called same-sex marriage. We might now call it
yes,
or marriage. And one of the study results found that a person who knows a gay person is 11 times more likely to vote for gay rights.
Yes.
And that just seemed logical to me, that I might or might not care about those random people I ever heard of once, but I'm going to care a lot more about my friend Bryant or his son Carter and what rights they have. But it also makes me think, when we're talking about this idea of taking baby steps, that when you know somebody who's gay or you know somebody who's trans identified, those are baby steps at every interaction. Those are baby steps at every email or every viewing of a Facebook or an Instagram post.
Yes. So allow me to make another example for you, because, by the way, these baby steps in conditioning is something that is called shaping, because you're not going to get somebody with a very complex behavior that's counterintuitive to just change right away. So the example I also wanted to give, which I use a lot in my classes, is potty training. You're not going to potty train a kid to go from using diapers at any given time to sitting on the potty and going without shaping them in between and taking baby steps, literally, because they're toddlers. So first you have to just get them comfortable sitting on the toilet, maybe not even with the lid up. Then you reward them for that, and every time they do that, they get used to it. So then the next step is, okay, now let's lift the lid, and now you sit on the toilet with, just the bowl. Then the next time is, now you got to take your diaper down and sit on it with your bare bottom. So we're shaping them gradually in that direction, because you're not just going to be able to reward them and say, hey, go do it all. So you reward them, and then you gradually reduce the rewards. And then eventually, through this shaping process of baby steps, then you're getting them to be fully potty trained. In this case, what you talk about knowing somebody, because again, part of that discrimination and part of the way that they act is because they buy into the stereotype that gay people are bad, or they're evil, or they're trying to convert you. They're trying to take away rainbows from God, whatever it is, right? So by knowing somebody that qualifies for this label, right? This, trans, bi, homosexual, whatever you want to call them, right? Gay, lesbian, knowing them and understanding and talking to them, then you can get to say, oh, well, I guess this person has the same belief systems I have. They have the same, likes and dislikes that I have. And so even though they're different from me, it's not like I've heard, it's not like the stories growing up, it's not like what the pastor told me. So maybe, and once you start to identify with people a little more, then you'll, as you said, be much more likely to advocate for their rights, or to at least be interested in their rights. And that's why you find that these numbers jump up to 11 times more likely to vote in that way if you know somebody personally, because it dispels the rumors, it breaks up those stereotypes, and that way you're shaping them and starting to make it more conscious, because now they're thinking about it instead of just reacting in that fight or flight manner.
So I know there's a lot of thought of information is good, but how do I use information? And it's making me think about the way that we use social media, actually. And
Yes.
for example, it's really common for white people to only have white people friends. It's
Yep.
especially in areas of the country where that's not a choice, that's just who's in the community. And maybe
Right.
people don't travel as much or they don't travel as far. And looking at, as a white person, when I look at the media, what do I see and where do I see Black people in the media? And as a kid in the 80s, looking at Black people on TV were drug dealers, and they were
Yep.
they were the bad guys on Law and Order. And it's why, for all the later politics involved in things, it's why the Cosby Show and the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and A Different World became so important. And I think now we're looking at, we still see the news stories of the Black on Black crime. And now we're also seeing a million replays of George Floyd's murder. We're seeing protests, but they're zooming out to show the violence, which connects our brain to the idea that if you protest for Black lives, you are violent, it's a problem.
Right.
But there is conversation in the Black community, and there is an intentional movement of being mindful to share. They're hashtagging it often Black Girl Magic or Black Boy Joy. And initially, as a white person, I didn't get it. And I think I'm continuing to learn as I grow in general, but also as you're talking about this idea of this baby stepping and shaping things, is if all the non-Black people see of Black people is criminals on reruns of Law and Order, or murdered, or in the news, and we find out, well, okay, the cops didn't know somebody had a criminal record, but then we found out, so maybe it's kind of okay that they were murdered, is a very different depiction of a group of people than to also see the college kids in a different world, than to also see the OBGYN and the lawyer of the Cosby Show, and the judge on the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And it seems like when we're not sure what to do, when we're just average people trying to figure out, this is a huge problem, what can I do? Finding ways to use our social media, even just to broadcast the joy of people, that it isn't just the marriage equality quotes, which are beautiful in their own right, but also just couples or families where somebody involved happens to be of same gender, or a transgender identified person, or maybe you can't tell based on their hairstyle and their clothing what their gender identity is.
Right.
Those moments, without us even realizing the brain science behind it, we've been doing that for the people in our social media circles every time we're posting something, especially in a month like June where we're looking at Pride Month.
Yes.
So even for the people we don't know, even for, the idea of Saturday Night Live's kind of drunk uncle, and our own versions and our own families of that one relative that we just feel like, I can't say anything, I'm just hitting a brick wall. Maybe we say nothing, but they just keep seeing our positive posts. We're baby stepping into their brain without them even knowing it.
Yes, it's true. But again, if it's unconscious, sometimes the brain may just ignore what it doesn't want. One of the things you brought up, the African American community, and obviously there's still people very much in the South, and you're just outside Tennessee, Nashville right now.
I am at the moment.
So you know that that views are not all the same across the country and definitely across the world. We already know the struggles that African American individuals have, and the way that they were portrayed on TV before these important, groundbreaking shows. Well, of course, you have the religious right, who always was talking about, homosexuality as the devil's tool and as, against God's will and things like that. And then you combine that with the 1980s with the AIDS epidemic, and it was just completely put on the shoulders of homosexual men. Not even lesbians or the other, pronouns or anything like that, the other classifications. And so what you have is something called an anchor bias as well, right? So if we think about, and I'm going to bring up another controversial subject, which is vaccinations, but just thinking about the counter protests, the anti-vaxxer movement was based on a scientific paper that came out that said vaccinations are linked to and can cause and do cause autism, which has been debunked over and over and over by science. But since that's the first thing that people heard, and that's the thing that their brain glommed onto, right? That's the thing that that it anchored to, that even though we have shown that the author of that study has admitted to fudging the data, lost his medical license, and it's you know,
it's garbage.
BS. It's garbage.
The brain
people
in the mental health community, we all know it's garbage, but you're right. Our
yes.
brains remember that study.
So they're going to still have that, you know, anchor in this, oh, homosexuality is bad, and, you know, AIDS epidemic is still based on that. And so they have this. And so through these social media posts, through these things, the conscious ability to open their eyes. And again, we have to use baby steps because this is the process of shaping. We have to let them know, okay, well, oh, maybe it's not exactly as I've heard. Maybe the stereotype is not true. Then you get to know somebody. And with these social media posts, the way that you're saying, sorry, I kind of went in a giant arc there.
Hey,
with these social media posts, it's a way to do it. There are, again, according to social psychology, there are two ways to make your point across. One is called the central route of persuasion, which is simply explaining these things in a calm manner that people will understand and give them the facts. And then there's the kind that a lot of people use to their advantage on social media called the peripheral route, which is just showing a propaganda video or putting a couple lines in, taking things out of context. And when people have a similar way of thinking, it strengthens that prejudice. It strengthens that discrimination, because people, you know, Republicans, Trumpers are going to get together with other Trumpers, and that's going to make them even more Trumpy. People who oppose Trump, more rational in that case, are going to get together, and that's going to also make them, you know, more against the views of Trump. So getting people to understand and try to buy into these social media posts are great to get a conversation started, to lead to that more central route where we can give them information. They can meet people and they're like, oh, this isn't how I pictured it. Oh, this is more like it. And then we can get that process going, making it more conscious, making it less biased based on unconscious data and information, and get them to understand the struggles that it's, you know, even though it doesn't have to do with them or their views, these people still deserve all of the same rights that we get.
In the early 90s, the third season of The Real World had it's hard to call a person a character when it's a reality show, but a person on the show,
right.
Pedro Zamora, who was gay and also HIV positive.
Yes.
And his role at the time, he had an actual job. This was back when they cast in a city where people already lived and they had real jobs and they just sort of filmed their lives. Unlike sort of the more recent, they ply them with alcohol and lock them in a room.
Yeah.
And he was an HIV/AIDS educator. And we, as the audience, followed him into rooms. We heard the people in the audience ask questions. We saw people engage with him. We saw house members that he lived with who wouldn't share a cup because they didn't know. And he actually, at the time, met someone during filming, fell in love. We watched them fall in love with each other. We watched their then commitment ceremony. And it happened to be that the night that the season finale aired, which was quite long after, it's probably 6 months after they finished filming, Pedro died of complications related to his AIDS infection. There's a street in Miami named for him to this day. And there's a lot of research that he was America's first HIV positive friend. And a lot of that research really looks at the reason he was so good at what he did and why it worked so well wasn't because of the way that he educated in a room, but it was because the audience watched him through the television. So he was simultaneously at my house where I feel comfortable, but also not actually at my house, so I didn't have to feel any sort of way about being near or around him, whatever I knew or didn't know about HIV or AIDS or a gay person or a Latino gay person. It was that ability to be in the house but far away that then later became, studies or research has been done to show that it's a lot like Will and Grace. And that was another, dispelled a lot of myths. Will was very much not the way we thought gay men were. Jack very much was what we as a society often thought gay men were. And,
stereotypical, yes.
Yeah, and we had Grace, who was Jewish character, but didn't have the stereotypical Jewish features. And the more time we as society spent with them, the more it started to change the way we thought about people. We saw it again with Modern Family. We've seen it with, we went from Ellen DeGeneres coming out and the show was canceled and she was blacklisted to she was the top of the daytime TV talk shows. And she went from being a pariah in our society to casually mentioning that she and her wife were at this event. And then she keeps going. And what we're thinking about is, ooh, what was the event? And not anything about that she said she had a wife, or why is same gender marriage legal in this country, or why were they out in public? None of those things, because that stopped being a thing for us to get hung up on. The more we heard about when she really wanted Mountain Dew, but the stores were closed, which reminded me of last week when I really wanted Mountain Dew and the stores were closed. And it seems like the more we push the media around us to be inclusive in their programming, and the more that we push and we push through what we watch, we push through what we're tweeting about. And I don't know what the verb for Instagramming, I don't know. Right. I'm not sure what that verb is. I'm apparently too old. I don't know what the young whippersnappers these days call it. I just want them off my lawn.
Off your lawn.
Right. But when we push for that, and when we're pushing for example, Black lead characters on a network show, not just on Oprah's network or on BET network, but in our mainstream, what the majority of people are watching, when we're pushing for shows where there are transgender characters or transgender people playing maybe non-transgender, cisgender characters, the more we push for that, the more we support it, the more the advertising money follows what we're watching. The more that gets the shows renewed. And when a show does well, a bunch of other networks try to duplicate it with their own sorts of shows with those sorts of characters too. So it sounds like we can't control other people's brains directly, but we can sort of help baby step them either through our social media accounts towards our family and friends, or towards our social media accounts and the way we interact with the media to get them to air what we're hoping goes into people's brain.
Yes. And as we talked about, human beings are very social creatures. And we talked about some of the other types of learning, like operant conditioning, using reward, punishment, making the unconscious conscious. But the other big type of learning that we do that I didn't talk about earlier is observational learning. So we learn by seeing others. And from a brain perspective, in our frontal lobe of the brain over here, just behind the forehead, are neurons that have been called mirror neurons. So when we are watching another person, when we're imitating them, whether it's trying to do the Macarena, or whether it's trying to copy their accent or sing like them or do something like that, then what happens is those mirror neurons are firing and we are engaged. So when we observe, it's how we learn to do things. My child copies a lot of things that I do, so I need to try to make sure that some of the bad things I've been known for, I don't do as much, because that's why children copy their parents and things like that. This is also the same with views that their families have, that their communities have, and things like that. So when you get exposure to things like seeing the real world, one of the things that you're doing is you're seeing that this is not as you heard it. This is not as the stereotype is. When you're educating yourself by observing, oh, this is what a person who's gay looks like or doesn't look like. This is not what I had in my head. Why Will's character, as opposed to Jack's character, is like, oh, well, there's this type of person that's gay too, because this person doesn't seem like that. And then you have those observations. And from there, you're actually learning. That's why I always talk in my classes about making sure the media, they can make it entertaining, but they also should have an obligation to get it right. Because you're actually, even though people know that these shows are fake, the scenarios can be very real world scenarios. And people will believe that. When they portray schizophrenia or they portray depression on a TV show or in a movie, people know the movie's fake, but they would have no idea whether or not this mental illness is portrayed in the right way. When I was growing up, I didn't know that schizophrenia and multiple personalities were different because they looked exactly the same in movies and on TV. So not only is it getting more of these shows, but it allows people to understand from an observational standpoint. And when your mirror neurons are working and when you're observing these things, it also is what increases empathy in the brain. So not just understanding, but actually feeling and getting that sense of, I may not know what you're going through, but I know that it's a struggle and I have different struggles and I can recognize that. And that is also part of that process of those baby steps. So internally and externally, you're getting observational data, you're getting empathy is being activated, you're educating them, right? And all of this through a show that's a sitcom that people are just enjoying because they have jokes that are funny. Sure. But you're getting a whole experience that you never knew you were getting.
I truly believe if you collapsed right now, well, you're far away, but if I was in the room with you and you collapsed, I absolutely believe that I could put in a trach, I can put in a chest tube, and you are good. The fact that you collapsed because you sprained your ankle would have no bearing on me putting in a chest tube or doing a trach. I absolutely believe I can do those things because I have spent a majority of my life watching ER and Grey's Anatomy.
Yes.
Oh yeah, no, I believe it. And so much so that when I had to have a surgery and I was already partially sedated, I apparently said to the doctor before they put me fully under and asked if I had questions, is anyone in this room secretly in love with anyone else or related to anyone else? Because I watch TV and when that happens, the patient dies on the table. Nobody? Right. No? Then I'm good. You can put me under. Because and that was not my very logical awake mind. But that is, we do look at that. We look at the good doctor and we think that that's what autism looks like. We often assume that we see so many people on TV with autism that have savant syndrome, where they are crazy level smart about something, that's what autism means. And for some people, right. But statistically, the majority, it's not. No. We've also seen, there was a study, I don't know, a while ago, about how, I think it was done specifically for white women. And I don't know why behind that, but there was a study of white women done that if you put 3 or 4 of them together and leave them alone, if one of them says something negative about her body, the others will say negative things about their own bodies. And it becomes this kind of loop of things that does not stop until something external changes it. So like if a drink order is given at a restaurant, and the server walks away. And then the way they did the study, I think, was somebody said like, oh my God, my thighs feel so fat in these shorts. And immediately the others at the table all picked apart their own bodies and kept going until the server brought the drinks back. So something external interrupted that pattern. And I might be remembering some of the details wrong, but it was like they waited longer and longer for the server to come back to see, will this eventually stop on its own? And it doesn't, because we stir up what it is that's around us. But they're also finding, and there have been, I think even just sort of anecdotal evidence amongst people, that if you say something nice in a group of people to somebody else in the group, that will also pick up. And sometimes that's because a person can't take a compliment. But often it's because when somebody makes you feel good, you want to make other people feel good. So we're stirring up in any direction, whatever it is that we're initiating, which means we have to be mindful when it's negative to not jump in.
Right.
It's sort of taking control over the things our brains tend to do without us having awareness that we can control them.
I agree.
So I know we're going to run short on time soon. We did have a question in the chat. How do we better explain equity that is a non-zero sum game? A lot of people have fear because it comes out of that perception. And they're right, we see that. And in some cases, unfortunately, it's true. If there is one job opening, the idea that there might be any sort of awareness of we have to strongly consider a Black person or a gay person or a veteran means the people who are not those characteristics don't have access to the job. Sometimes it is a zero-sum game, but when it comes to, for example, same-gender marriage or transgender equality, where it doesn't harm anybody else, what's our brain doing that makes us think we have to fight that?
Again, you are going against your instincts and you are fearing what you don't know. And usually the narrative is marriage is between a man and a woman. That marriage is only to have children. So at that point, maybe you're even discriminating against people that aren't able to have children as well. And you're putting them in the same boat. And it threatens their way of life because that's counterintuitive to the way that they grew up. That's counterintuitive to how they learned about life. And they fear what they don't know. So again, this idea of baby steps is really the way to do it. Find somebody that is gay and that you can see is not going to harm you or your way of life. And then maybe, be able to get that empathy going, observation, learn to understand that it's not going to harm you, and hopefully eventually be able to turn that perspective around.
So before we run out of time, I want to kind of flip the reverse of this too. We've talked about how do we kind of get to and help shape the people who are not so inclusive, not so accepting. Mm-hmm. What about the people who are being harmed by that process, that are stuck in a country or a city or a town or wherever, where they're having to do by just existing, their existence is political? How do we help them, or how can they protect themselves in the process of having to be around that, because baby stepping takes time?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? That is something that people face on a daily basis. And obviously you're a pretty big expert in, finding somebody that's an ally, in, understanding and believing and knowing that what you're doing is not immoral or improper, or, should not be discriminated against or things like that. And, just sticking through with it. And, I think you should be able to add some more to this.
Sure.
In that
yeah,
case.
I mean, from our patterns kind of go together, that you catch what the brain is doing, and then I shape what the behavior is that comes from that. Yeah. And often what we find is that people are getting really overwhelmed. There's a lot of conversation about not feeling valued. And some of that is because mm-hmm. the experience isn't validated by people.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's because the way that we communicate, the way we're taught in American English, for example, to communicate, is this idea of, for a conversation to happen, it has to be both sides of something. So what someone's saying, you have to find another side and then bring that side in. And it's this sort of debate style, even if that's not how the feelings are, that idea of a devil's advocate. Mm-hmm. And what can happen sometimes is when somebody shares their experience, our inclination then is to bring up the sort of volley it back from the other side. And sometimes right. that's to undermine, it's really actually not that bad, you're exaggerating it, or it's this version of it could be worse, or you think it's bad for you, let me tell you this. And it's this weird like oppression Olympics and trauma Olympics.
Yep.
And at the end of it, it means two people probably shared a bunch of really traumatic stories, and both of them walk away feeling worse.
Right.
And that's not what's supposed to happen, right? Like, we're taught if you talk about your feelings, you feel better. But a lot of that is really just more the idea of bearing witness to it. I very much see it as when somebody's sharing their experience, especially if it's an older experience. So maybe they're sharing the first time someone called them the N-word, or the first time they came out to someone who called them a homophobic or a transphobic slur. Those sorts of things that didn't happen 5 minutes ago, but maybe was 5 months, 5 years, 5 decades ago.
Yes.
I liken it to they've got a scar or a scab and they've picked at it. They've let themselves bleed in front of you to show you that that causes bleeding.
Yeah.
And so for somebody to turn around and say, I mean, but you're not bleeding that much. Or, yeah, but there was this other time that I got injured and oh my God, I had a nosebleed once. I bled way more than you're bleeding.
Yeah.
Or, you know, you should see the person in this other country who's bleeding way worse than you're bleeding, isn't acknowledging first that somebody is bleeding. And second, that they gave you a gift. I think we often in conversation forget that when somebody tells us something about themselves that isn't fun or easy, they're giving us the gift of their time and of their story and of the trust in the vulnerability of their feelings.
Right.
What they meet back is any type of resistance, even if it's because it doesn't match our worldview. We're further harming someone who just told us a story of a time they were harmed.
Yep. And a lot of it has to do with the willingness to be open about it and to accept that and to just say, don't correct what I'm saying, just acknowledge and listen. Don't just accept what I'm saying. Don't try to argue with it, or don't make this a pissing contest where you're trying to one up me, or you're trying to compare apples to oranges when I talk about this experience and you talk about something completely different. Like, that's not what we need. And it still goes back to the stigma of mental health, and that sharing your feelings has been used. You know, people say, oh, well, you sharing your feelings is, and then insert your homophobic slur here, or insert your mental illness stigma here. And so that narrative has gotten a lot better in the last 20 years because of social media movements. Before we heard Kevin Love in the NBA talk about panic attacks, nobody ever thought that athletes who cannot be mentally weak, they have to be mentally and physically sound, couldn't ever go through this. Or Britney Spears, when she shaved her head because of all of the things that caused her anxiety, to have a mental breakdown. And people are like, well, she has so much money that she shouldn't have a mental breakdown. Well, your brain doesn't respond to money. These types of stigmas we're getting better with these things, just like we're getting better with LGBTQ equality and rights, but there's still a long way to go to change people's minds.
I think a lot of it, when we look at all the things that make us different and all the baby stepping that it can take, and the shaping and the scaffolding and sort of all of these ideas of what makes the brain do things that causes the person to do things. We base a lot of it on trying to find the common ground with somebody and trying to treat people we've had this long idea of treat people the way you want to be treated. And it makes a lot of sense the way that it used to be, that white people would say, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. It's a fantastic theoretical concept for the person already in power. What it does is it actually removes the humanity of the person who's already being harmed. And so it isn't about treat me the way that you want to be treated. Like you would like a free day to watch nothing but basketball for the entire time and drink a good alcoholic drink. You can give that to me and I would be fairly miserable. None of that is what I would choose or want. I can watch an entire marathon of Grey's Anatomy and eat my way through a box of cereal dry, and I would make you very miserable if I got you to do that. Because it's not about treat people the way you want to be treated. It's finding out the way they need to be treated and treating them that way, regardless of whether you understand why they need that type of treatment.
Yes.
And so I know we are coming to unfortunately, the tail end of our conversation. And more good stuff is coming up with Power to Fly. What are your closing thoughts on this one, Dr. Bryant Horowitz?
My closing thoughts are that we still have a lot of work to do, but the work is worth it. That the brain is fixed in sort of its unconscious biases. And again, the best way to combat that is to make the unconscious conscious. Baby steps, don't try to persuade somebody fully by one conversation. Also, don't give up. Know that the power of empathy is there. We just have to unlock it in our brain. For some, it's easier than others. And that all of the trials and tribulations that we go through are worth it.
I agree completely. For the people who are looking for some action steps on things, one of the really great tools that exists, write it down somewhere, Google it later, don't leave us at Power to Fly, but keep an eye out. There's an implicit bias test that Harvard does. It's Harvard. I think you can just Google Harvard implicit bias.
You can.
Okay. And it'll bring up a series of different options of different categories of people or dynamics or aspects of people. And you complete these super simple, doesn't require any real effort, costs you no money kinds of tests. And it will tell you where some of your biases are based on your reaction times to things and based on other details that you can't manipulate. So for example, one of them is white and black, and it will give you some insight into your level of implicit racism. And that might be towards Black people. It might be an inherent implicit bias against white people because racism requires power, which means you can't be racist against white people. That's a whole other
right.
So there's that to look at, the Harvard implicit bias tests. Also, especially now that we're in Pride Month, be keeping an eye on your social media, find places of joy. It's important to share the historical aspects. It's important to share the realities of suicide risks and harm risks. Yes, it is also really critical that you're finding the positive, the joyful things, the images, the videos, the movies, sharing those as well, sharing those stories so that people are seen as human and happen to be demographics rather than the demographic as their identity. And we hope people remember that they're also human.
Right.
So you
Absolutely.
can check those out. You can come find, I think the links to books and things are in the chat, or they were earlier. And as we get back to go into the next session for Power to Fly, you know, I've had so much fun, and I feel like it's going to be almost as much fun, or maybe equally as much fun, to see what comes up next. For those of you who want to join another conversation with me, I've got one going on race specifically coming up on Thursday. So check the schedule and your time zone on that. I will not try to tell you the time zone. I'll get it all wrong. So it looks like it is about to be time probably for Hunter to jump back in and kick us out of here because somebody else more awesome than we are is coming up. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you both. That was fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Bryant Horowitz. And thank you very much, sir. That was very, very good. That right at the end there, the power of empathy is there. We just have to unlock it in our brain. Incredible stuff.